People say that. He lost $50 million. No, that's not even close to what happened to this dude. And until you understand what happened to the dude, you don't understand what happened.
After 20 long years, one of the darkest Hollywood secrets of the early 2000s is about to be laid to rest. Dave Chappelle was always known as the comedic realist, but when he turned down life-changing money and vanished to another continent, he became the crazy, funny guy. Now, Katt Williams has dropped a bombshell on all Dave's critics. It wasn't 50 million, but a whopping 500 million. But that's not all. Someone stole the money from Dave. Who could it be? And why did it take so long for these answers to surface? Join us as we reveal who stole $500 million from Dave Chappelle. The carefully crazy narrative. Everyone thinks they know Dave Chappelle, that he is this comedy genius who went crazy, walked away from $50 million, and vanished into the wilderness of Africa without any warning. In fact, it was the whole rave on social media, and since so many geniuses couldn't handle their own success, it was easy to believe that Dave was one of them. But is that really the full story? Did he really walk away from $50 million on a whim, abandoning fortune and fame for some spontaneous realization? The public only took pieces and bits of his life and stitched them together into a story they were already familiar with. Yet they ignore the real truths of Hollywood, especially when it comes to a person of color, and the exploitative contracts that often disguise themselves as opportunities. While they become creative slaves, others profit from their labor. But why would Dave work as hard as he did and then walk away from money that could have changed his life? Could the rumors be slightly true? Well, it turned out that Dave never walked away, and the money was not $50 million or even $100 million. It was something much bigger, and it only raised more questions. What if the crazy label was a convenient shield for a much darker and more expensive truth? For anyone looking more closely, the first cracks in that story emerged when reporters and insiders began examining the actual contracts and the real financial structure behind Chappelle's show. What they uncovered didn't just raise eyebrows, it shook them to their core. The deeper the journalists went, the uglier it looked. They found projected earnings buried in quarterly reports, financial models for global reruns, and payout charts tied to DVD sales during the era when DVDs were printing money. The numbers weren't just big, they were obscene, and that's when the real bombshell dropped. The 50 million figure wasn't off by a few million here or there. It was off by entire leagues, by orders of magnitude. By the time they had carefully gone through everything, the truth stared them down. This wasn't a $50 billion deal. It was nearly $500 million in projected lifetime value. This is part of the money the studio expected to make and what Dave was contractually supposed to share in. But somehow, in a rather convenient manner, this was money the public never heard about. So while the world laughed at Dave, only the people who had the most to gain from hiding the real numbers knew them. And suddenly, the crazy narrative started to look less like a coincidence and more like a strategy. A strategy to steal from Dave using an unbelievable deal. These are the mechanics behind the deal. A 360-degree contract meant that the network and affiliated studios would take a cut of virtually every revenue stream tied to Dave's work: merchandise, appearances, licensing, and syndication rights. Dave himself would earn a fraction unless he agreed to terms that effectively gave the studio ownership of his intellectual property.
360 deals came out of the music industry where record labels were struggling to make money from their artists.
Put simply, the money wasn't just in a single paycheck. The real fortune was in the rights and control over the work he had built, and those rights were being withheld. The first hint that the story was wrong came from former staff and writers who witnessed Dave negotiating with executives. They described tense meetings where Dave demanded transparency and creative control. When those demands weren't met, the numbers on the table suddenly became meaningless. Then Katt Williams and other peers began dropping hints in interviews years later. They spoke about the exploitation built into Hollywood deals, and how Dave's supposed walkaway wasn't just a whim, but a strategic refusal to be financially stripped of his own creation. These discussions, combined with investigative reporting, created the first public understanding that the $50 million story was not just incomplete, it was actively misleading. Finally, Dave himself confirmed the truth in later interviews. While never giving exact numbers, he spoke about the contracts, the rights, and the enormous sums the show had generated for others. While he had a very limited claim, the public began to realize that what seemed like a simple lost fortune was actually a story of financial injustice and misrepresentation. But if the public was so wrong about the price tag, then what was the real value of everything Dave built? And how much did he truly walk away from? The real price tag. To understand why the fortune he refused to compromise over was not only justified but modest in comparison to the empire he created, one must first look at the state of comedy and television in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and the considerable impact Dave had on it. Comedy at the turn of the millennium was in crisis. Although network sitcoms dominated television, many were stuck playing it safe. They relied on broad stereotypes, laugh tracks, and punchlines that were too predictable. Worst still were shows that featured black actors. Those fell into two categories. One was a category for sitcoms that reinforced existing racial cliches, and the other was about sketch shows that avoided biting social commentary just to satisfy advertisers and executives. As a result, the audience remained dissatisfied. They wanted authentic representation, but even though talent was plentiful, the industry barely offered outlets for performers to tell stories with satire. Enter Dave. By the time Chappelle's show premiered on Comedy Central in 2003, Dave had already earned a reputation in the stand-up world as one of the most intelligent and fearless comedians of his generation.
Hi, I'm here to bail out my buddy.
Dave wasn't just funny. He had his way with any words. He'd break down topics like race, class, and politics, and add them to his comedy in a way no one had seen before. His sharp wit could provoke both laughter and discomfort amongst those who preferred the half-truths. He used comedy as a mirror, forcing viewers to confront truths that networks typically sanitized. Dave's genius lay in his understanding that comedy could do more than entertain. It could educate, provoke debate, and shift cultural conversation. At a time when mainstream television often depicted black characters in limiting, caricatured roles, Dave brought complexity, intelligence, and moral consciousness to the screen. He wasn't there to perpetuate stereotypes. He was there to dismantle them, to hold a mirror to society, and to challenge audiences while making them laugh. Chappelle's show was more than a hit. It was a revolution. Sketches like Charlie Murphy's True Hollywood Stories recontextualized the narrative of black culture in Hollywood history, while The Racial Draft satirized America's obsession with racial identity. Ratings soared, but so did influence. Critics lauded the show for its daring approach. Peers celebrated it for redefining what television could accomplish, and audiences across racial and socioeconomic lines engaged with its sharp observations. The financial and cultural stakes were immense. By crafting content that resonated universally, Dave created an asset of extraordinary value. Syndication deals, merchandising, and licensing alone represented untapped wealth, and yet the standard network contracts offered to him barely accounted for the full scope of his contribution. He wasn't merely a performer, he was a creator, a producer, and a cultural architect. In other words, Dave was building an empire that extended far beyond the paycheck offered to him at any single point in time. Beyond his creative brilliance, Dave also solved the existential crisis in television comedy between authenticity and marketability. While networks feared controversy, advertisers feared backlash, and many executives assumed audiences would respond only to safe, formulaic content. Dave proved them wrong. In doing so, he set a precedent that would influence generations of comedians, writers, and producers. Dave's entitlement to wealth was not simply a matter of celebrity compensation, it was the recognition of a unique combination of creativity, risk, and cultural impact. He had stepped into a broken system, built something extraordinary, and transformed an entire medium. Networks and studios benefited from his labor, insight, and intellect. The financial stakes, hundreds of millions, if not billions, were proportional to the empire he had constructed. Any claim that he walked away from a modest sum ignores the reality. He was fighting for ownership of the work he created, for the ability to dictate its trajectory. and for compensation that reflected the true value he brought to the industry. Under the kind of pressure mounted on Dave, and perhaps out of fear for his life, he made a decision that shocked even his family. How does a troubled star escape being out of their mind? The Africa Exodus. By the end of Chappelle's show's second season, the world had begun to take notice, not just of Dave's humor, but of the cultural earthquake he had created. Ratings were soaring, advertisers were thrilled, and yet behind the scenes, Dave was increasingly disillusioned. The intense scrutiny, the creative compromises, and the feeling that his work was being co-opted for profit rather than respected for its genius began to weigh heavily. It was during this period that Dave made a decision that would astonish the world. He vanished. No, he didn't just leave the show. He left the entire continent. In 2005, Dave boarded a plane to South Africa, and for months, he disappeared from public life. Immediately, social media was flooded with speculation about where he was and why he had left. But Dave's Africa trip was neither unplanned nor escapist, as the headlines suggested. He was clear about his purpose, though the message was filtered through rumor and misunderstanding. In interviews years later, Dave explained that the trip was a period of reflection and self-assessment. He needed distance from the intense pressures of Hollywood, and from a system that seemed intent on commodifying every aspect of his talent. And Africa played that role perfectly. The public, however, was largely unconcerned with nuance. To most observers, disappearing for months in Africa was just further evidence of crazy behavior. Critics suggested he was abandoning responsibilities, hiding from commitments, or acting on some impulsive emotional whim. These accusations were reinforced by prominent voices in the media and entertainment industry, who found it easier to question his mental state than acknowledge the pressures that had prompted the decision. Some columnists framed it as a dramatic retreat, painting Dave as a man consumed by fame and money, ironically rejecting the very wealth he had fought to earn. Among the individuals who publicly questioned Dave's sanity was entertainment commentator Andy Levy, who suggested in a 2005 broadcast that Dave's disappearance was the behavior of someone overwhelmed by success. Levy and others like him leaned on the widely reported dollar figure, creating a narrative that the comedian had literally walked away from a fortune he could not comprehend.
Very grateful. Hello, police.
To the public, this framed Dave's Africa trip as proof of instability, rather than an act of strategic reflection and self-preservation. Meanwhile, that was far from the truth. Dave used his time in Africa to engage with the culture, history, and his own personal reflection. Sources close to him noted that he spent his days reading, exploring local communities, and thinking through the direction of his career and creative projects. The trip was not a vacation. It was a deliberate, disciplined retreat from a system he believed was morally and creatively corrupt. This period allowed him to assess how to maintain creative autonomy to avoid exploitation and to define his priorities. The African exile also highlighted a pattern in Hollywood that few outside the industry understood at the time. When artists resist control, the story is often rewritten to focus on perceived irrationality rather than legitimate concerns. In Dave's case, the simplification of events into "he went to Africa," "he walked away from money," "he is crazy" obscured the more significant truth: a man fighting to retain ownership of his work, his creative voice, and his moral integrity. It was during this period that some industry figures continued to pressure Dave, hoping he would return and resume production under the original terms. He received calls, meetings were scheduled, and advisors attempted to convince him to abandon his principles in favor of immediate financial reward. Yet Dave remained firm, signaling that the Africa trip was as much about establishing boundaries as it was about personal reflection. Interestingly, Dave claimed that his time abroad also allowed him to reflect on the broader role of comedy and satire in society. Away from the constant noise of Hollywood, he considered how his work could continue to challenge power structures, cultural hypocrisy, and racial stereotypes without being co-opted by the commercial demands of networks. He realized that stepping away temporarily would not harm his legacy but would protect it, ensuring that when he returned, it would be on his terms. Despite the rumors and accusations, Dave emerged from Africa with a renewed sense of purpose, though the world would continue to misunderstand him for years. But if walking away from millions made the world call him crazy, what does it say about a system that mistakes principle for madness? The ally and the proof. When Dave returned from Africa, the world was still buzzing with the same headlines. But beneath the surface, a different story was beginning to emerge, one rooted in facts and testimony from people who had been inside the system. And at the center of that revelation was an unlikely ally, Katt Williams. Katt Williams was not only a fellow comedian, he was a survivor of the same pressures that had nearly destroyed Dave. Known for his outspoken personality and for pushing back against industry exploitation, Katt had navigated controversies, canceled tours, and public scrutiny, all while maintaining his career. Where most peers remained silent, Katt spoke openly about the mechanics of Hollywood contracts, creative suppression, and the subtle, often invisible, ways artists were robbed of their own work. In this sense, he was uniquely positioned to shed light on what had really happened with Dave. The first concrete cracks began with Williams' observations. In interviews years after Dave's Africa trip, Katt described how the $50 million figure was misleading.
But Dave Chappelle was decapitated in front of us. And until we deal with that, until we deal with...
He explained the concept of a 360-degree deal, in which the network or studio claims ownership not only of the artist's salary, but also of residuals, merchandising, licensing, and intellectual property. Chappelle's show generated enormous revenue through reruns, DVD sales, and merchandising, money that was largely untouchable for him under the original contract. The $50 million reported in the media was barely a fraction of the potential earnings he had created. Williams even went further. He told reporters that Dave's exit was not impulsive, it was strategic. By stepping away, Dave was challenging a system designed to exploit creative talent. "People see him as crazy," Katt said in one interview, "but that man walked away from billions to keep his soul intact, and most folks have no idea what that really means." His words were one of the first public confirmations that the mainstream narrative had been distorted. Dave was not rejecting a paycheck, he was rejecting an unjust system. Insiders from Comedy Central and production staff corroborated Williams' account. Writers, crew members, and producers spoke off the record about how executives had attempted to control every aspect of the show, from content to scheduling, and how Dave had consistently pushed back. They described meetings where Dave insisted on creative ownership, proper compensation for residuals, and the right to approve merchandising and syndication deals. These discussions revealed the real scale of what he had walked away from, not tens of millions, but potentially hundreds of millions of dollars, revenue streams over which he had little control. On one hand, the revelation confirmed what insiders had suspected all along. Dave's departure was principled, not impulsive. On the other hand, it drew renewed scrutiny and even threats from those who saw him challenging the status quo. Studios, executives, and industry insiders who relied on control over talent now viewed him as a dangerous precedent. By publicly validating his story, Katt Williams placed himself and Dave under a microscope, exposing them to criticism and professional risk. Dave responded cautiously. In interviews, he confirmed the general outlines of the financial stakes, but remained careful not to disclose exact numbers. He emphasized that the trip to Africa and his hiatus had been about reflection and autonomy, not a dramatic rejection of wealth. By doing so, he reinforced the emerging truth. The story that had circulated for years about him walking away from $50 million in a fit of madness was not only incomplete, but fundamentally misleading. The importance of Katt Williams' role cannot be overstated. Not only did he serve as a witness to all of Dave's troubles, but he was also a kind of translator trying to help the public understand the financial chains Dave had to escape. He had to let them know that Dave was but a small part of an even larger issue in Hollywood. This was a job he did great at because the public finally understood the truth of the situation. Other comedians and entertainers soon began to corroborate aspects of the story, painting a broader picture of a system designed to extract maximum profit from artists while minimizing their control. The conversation shifted from gossip to industry critique, and the public slowly began to understand that Dave's actions had been deliberate, principled, and financially justified. If standing up for your own work makes the world question your sanity, how many others have been silenced before their story could be told? A systemic plague and a changed man. By the time the world began to understand the real story behind Dave Chappelle's Africa retreat and financial stand, one thing became clear: his case was not an anomaly. The exploitation he faced was part of a larger systemic problem in the entertainment industry, one that had ensnared countless artists before him. Networks and studios had long perfected a method of turning talent into cash while stripping creators of control, and Dave's stand had thrown a harsh spotlight on this machinery. Consider Monique, whose battle with Netflix over fair compensation echoes Dave's struggles. Despite winning an Academy Award for Precious, Monique was offered a fraction of what her male and white peers would earn for a comedy special. When she refused, she faced blacklisting and a dramatic slowdown of her career. Her story revealed a chilling pattern. Even when artists deliver extraordinary value, the system can punish them for asserting their worth. If this is what happens to other creators, could Dave's fight really have been so isolated? Taylor Swift's dispute over her masters presents a similar scenario, this time in the music industry. Swift painstakingly built her catalog, only to have the rights to her early recordings sold without her consent. Like Dave, she refused to accept being stripped of ownership over work she had created. Both cases illuminate a universal truth. Across entertainment mediums, creators face a system designed to maximize profit for intermediaries, while limiting the agency of the talent itself. And yet, Dave's story stands out because he confronted the system before the public fully understood it, risking reputation and fortune in the process. The consequences of standing up are profound, and they shape artists in ways the public rarely sees. For Dave, the combination of betrayal, pressure, and moral conflict left a lasting mark. The man who returned from Africa was not the same performer who had once dazzled audiences with fearless commentary. He was more guarded, more deliberate, and far more aware of the traps that the industry laid for creative talent. But this awareness did not dampen his commitment to principle. Instead, it reshaped the way he wielded it. If the system could change him so fundamentally, what did that mean for the fearless persona audiences had once celebrated? His post-hiatus work reflects this change.
That's when I started doing. I used to, in the summer, I started riding motorcycles, which is like very uncharacteristic of me, but I loved it.
Where he used pure audacity, Dave now introduced a balance of calculation. Even though he still addressed uncomfortable social truths, he did so with a precision that suggested careful navigation of the consequences. It was now obvious that the idealistic recklessness that powered Chappelle's show had been tempered by experience. The lessons learned in Africa, combined with first-hand knowledge of financial exploitation, gave him a new approach, one that allowed him to maintain creative freedom while minimizing personal and professional risk. And yet, the system itself remained largely intact. Hollywood continued to exploit artists under complex contracts, using opaque financial structures to retain control while profiting from talent. Dave's story has exposed this cycle, showing both the dangers of defiance and the personal toll exacted by resisting. If someone of Dave Chappelle's influence could feel the weight of the system, how much harder must it be for lesser-known artists to maintain control over their work? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.